We're going to look at a slightly different topic for our next session, but one that is, of course, no less relevant. In fact, it's enormously relevant to everyone in this room. It's about Asia's rise and the coming global attitude adjustment. The rise of Asia and the Asian middle class is, in some respects, the biggest story of our times. In the coming decade, a deeper realization of Asia's growing economic weight and global influence will trigger, perhaps, a global attitude adjustment. And we're already, I think, seeing that play out in many different spheres. So we have a great panel to discuss this particular topic. We have one person in the room. It's Amy Chang, Deutsche Bank Asia Pacific Head of Communications and CSR. Welcome, Amy. And then joining us on screen, we have Diageo Asia Pacific Head of Communications and Society, Asma Sukandar. And we have BCW Regional Head of Corporate and Public Affairs, Douglas Dew. There they are on screen. Hello to both of you. It's a shame you can't be here in person, obviously, but it's great to see you anyway. Before we get into the discussion, Douglas is going to take us through some interesting slides, which I think will set a very useful context for this discussion. So, Douglas, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, everyone. So, if we go to the third slide, which is the first part of the content. So when we think about Asia's rise and reactions to it, it's important to have historical perspective. And this slide shows GDP of major powers over the last 2,000 years. And it's fascinating to look at the massive share of GDP occupied by China and India right up until the 19th century. So from this perspective, as we return to a situation where GDP size correlates more closely with population size, in many ways it is much a renaissance as it is a rise. And it's important to understand how leaders and people in countries of Asia see and understand this arc of history and the way it is used in political historical ideas such as the China Dream. We also need to consider that people in other parts of the world will have different ideas about and understandings of history and historical destiny. And this will potentially have a big impact on how they react to Asia's rise and the rise of Asian countries like China and India. Consider, for example, how those in the West who thought we had seen a kind of end of history with the rise of the West and supposedly Western ideas will feel as the West shrinks in importance in certain ways and Asia rises. So if we go to the next slide. So when we look out into the future, Asia's rise economically is set to continue as it occupies an increasingly large share of the global economy on multiple measures, including here, capital distribution. According to this chart from Thomas Piketty, Asian countries should own about half of world capital by the end of the 21st century. So with rising economic and technological power, Asian countries will also become more powerful in other ways. And they'll also very likely grow more confident and assertive as a result. So Asians will likely expect to be rule makers as opposed to rule takers to a much larger extent in the future. They'll also likely become even more confident in the wisdom of their own cultures and way of doing things. And they may be much less willing to accept advice from foreigners on certain topics and in certain situations. If we move to the next slide. So here we're looking out into the next decade with growth forecasts by 2030 on various measures of GDP. And it's fascinating to think about how the world will react to a China that is twice as big as the US, or 1.5 times as big as the US in terms of GDP by 2030, especially when we think about the reactions we've already seen to China's rise today, when China is a bit bigger or a bit smaller than the US in GDP size. What about when India becomes the second largest economy in the world? What about when Indonesia moves into the top 5? Indeed, the rise of these two countries could have an especially profound effect on global thinking in the coming decade, partly because their rise has been underappreciated so far. The world will certainly be thinking differently about Asia, and Asians will be thinking differently about themselves as Asia's rise continues. And we expect a range of attitudinal tipping points and Sputnik moments could lead to a significant global attitude adjustment about Asia in the coming decade. This is as Asia's rise permeates global consciousness more deeply, and many more people come to think it really is the Asian century. This is going to present a range of challenges and opportunities for global companies navigating Asia's rise, and for us as advisors from a communications and public affairs and other perspectives. The final slide, if we go to the next one. So there are many different implications of Asia's rise and reactions to it. One of the core dynamics will almost certainly be rising confidence in Asia versus rising concern in the West, especially among those who see it as a zero-sum situation. There's a major potential for misunderstanding and conflict, in part due to very significant cultural differences and preferences. In certain parts of the world, especially those that are growing slowly, if at all, and that have very high levels of inequality, we're likely to see various types of blame games and fear-mongering in response to Asia's rise. So going forward, it will be increasingly important that we're able to understand these historical, political, cultural, and other dynamics as we help global companies navigate Asia's rise and the reactions to it. We're going to have an enhanced ability to balance and manage often competing and even conflicting stakeholder expectations and responses to Asia's rise in different ways. And Asia capacity, Asia understanding is going to be increasingly important among global leadership teams. So we'll have to support global leaders in building that kind of understanding, and global companies and organisations are going to have to increasingly select leaders based partly on their capacity to understand the region and their experience of the region. So with that, I'll hand it back to Arun and the panel. That was meant just to set the scene, and looking forward to participating in a discussion of these dynamics.
Thank you very much, Douglas. It's really useful context for this discussion. And let's start perhaps with your last point for my first question. How hard is it to balance potentially conflicting and competing stakeholder expectations when it comes to these trends playing out? So, Amy, if I could start with you as you're in the room.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a massive understatement to just say, yes, it's extremely difficult to balance all of these. I mean, particularly for an organization like ours, which is truly global and has multiple centers of, let's say, decision-making and multiple centers of priorities that are sometimes divergent. That absolutely feeds into all of the stuff that Doug was just talking about, which is that the way in which this phenomenon, this big change in Asia's place in the world is being seen, depending on where you sit in the world, obviously informs viewpoints and can be interpreted very differently. So simple things like how we communicate success in this part of the world needs to be filtered through that lens in order to be globally palatable.
Okay. Asma, over to you. What do you make of that question?
I think I echo what Amy said, that it can be challenging, definitely. But at the same time, I also want to postulate that it's not necessarily different from if it wasn't Asia and it was another region, or between markets have challenges of different types of stakeholders and their demands. So I feel a bit as if the environment that we're in now is just so much more cross-boundary anyway. And I think you see a lot more of that now with, sort of the impact of the pandemic, that these sort of competing interests internally or competing ways of seeing things is kind of the par for the course if you're a big multinational company. The fact that it's Asia that's sort of rising now, I think brings attention to some aspects of, say, organizational culture, which Amy kind of touched on, that maybe are already sort of part of a trend, like looking at, sort of more inclusive ways of interpreting success, or more inclusive voices within organizations to share successes. I think sometimes the discourse on Asia's rise is sort of interpreted, as Doug mentioned in one of his points, as a zero-sum game, when there's actually a lot of opportunities and potential. I find that, just pivoting a little bit, if you think about the rise of Asia in sort of pop culture, of just culture, it doesn't seem as scary to a lot of people. BTS, the first band since the Beatles to have 3 #1 hits on the Billboard within an annual, within a calendar year. Netflix, which I think is a proponent of inclusion in a weird way, because, you see a lot of shows that are from different parts of Asia Pacific now more available to people. Looking at things like, the Oscars or TV, which now a lot of people working from home, they're watching a bit more of it. So when you see that rise of Asia kind of being a center of creativity and excellence in that sense, it seems to be okay. It's this other part when you talk about GDP and sort of the money, I guess, talks, that I sense a little bit more of this struggle or challenge.
It's interesting because underlying your comment, I think, is this idea that Asia's rise is a threat to, let's say, established interests. And we know that when we talk about MNCs, often we are talking about Western-based MNCs, although, of course, that is also something that is changing quite rapidly. Doug, how hard is it, in your experience, and looking at some of the clients that you're counseling, when it comes to balancing these competing stakeholder expectations, especially when Asia's rise does sometimes seem to carry these kinds of value judgments with it?
I think many global companies are looking at Asia's rise foremost as an opportunity, and they definitely see it as a win-win, positive sum opportunity. So I think that those that are reacting in the kind of from a zero-sum game perspective are more often the stakeholders in the home markets who feel like that they might be losing out when the global company's investing more in another part of the world than they are at home, and that kind of dynamic. So our clients need to be increasingly aware of, when they announce new investments in China or India or Korea or Japan, how their stakeholders in their home countries may react to that, particularly where there's this growing emphasis on reshoring and building supply chains at home and bringing back manufacturing and that kind of thing. Then there's also the political issues and the values-oriented issues where there's been much greater scrutiny and focus and attention. There's various drivers of that, obviously, and that's growing harder for companies to reconcile, because Asian governments are also being more assertive. At the same time, there's more pressure from NGOs and governments in the West and other parts of the world. So the ante is being upped from both sides. Global companies are being accused of being pawns of influence of Asian governments and that kind of thing. So it's getting more heated and more challenging, and companies need to tread more carefully going forward and have that institutional capacity to be able to understand these competing expectations and to do the risk analysis and to ensure that that there's a truly global decision-making process around how to address these issues with adequate representation of teams in Asia at that global decision-making table, and having the voice of Asia heard adequately in those kinds of considerations and discussions.
So I guess the next question would be, how do we make that happen, and how much of a challenge is that? Because one of the things that often seems to be an issue is perhaps a disconnect between HQ and local operations in this part of the world. And you can see that in terms of the communications at times. You can see that in terms of responses to certain issues. You can see that in terms of the campaigns that companies come out with, which aren't always necessarily best positioned for a local market in this part of the world. Amy, how difficult is it in terms of, I suppose, educating the rest of your organization about Asia? And of course, when we say Asia, Asia itself, I mean, I feel like we're educating ourselves about Asia is hard enough because it's such a diverse region. And, the word Asia itself is kind of meaningless. But how, working within the sort of the neat geographies that MNCs enjoy, how difficult is that?
I'd say it's kind of job one for me is an education process, like you say, in terms of championing the region, how diverse it is, and making people, like getting in people's face so that they understand at HQ and everywhere else around the world all of the trends that Doug laid out beforehand. So it's not necessarily difficult. It is just a process that needs to be undertaken, and you just need to open up the ears of the people that are there, because it's very easy. It had always been the past where people could kind of look at this region kind of, as you were alluding to execute a global strategy. Let's just localize it and get that done. I think we can see from the slides that Doug put up, that's not going to fly anymore. And I think things have progressed and matured really significantly and rapidly out here, to the point where it's the job of people like us in the room to be making that noise within our organizations. And kind of one other thing that I would add to that is, when I look at our industry, like what all of us as communicators are doing in this region, I generally am like, it is so under-resourced capacity-wise in MNCs that are based outside of the region, precisely because there was this prevailing attitude of, yes, we can kind of apply our global, we, of course, tailor it locally, but that we could operate in the same way out here. I think the nuances and the complexities, even intra-region, that need to be better understood require capacity building and additional thought. So
more budget, more resources.
I think everyone in the room can probably agree about that. Yeah.
I think so, for sure. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've seen some examples of companies basing global innovation centers in Asia, even when they're not from this region, and maybe leading some global functions. But to your point, it does seem more prevalent that functions are under-resourced here, especially communications. I mean, that's a rare one that rarely seems to be leading global from Asia. Asma, how do you deal with that challenge at Diageo?
Well, to echo again, we're all in agreement on this panel. In front of people, really, that Asia Pacific is one very different, because people have that in their minds as a concept, maybe, and they know it, but the reality of it is sometimes in the day-to-day kind of forgotten, and just getting more visible. I think within, say, a big multinational, like literally visible. We have a lot of programs in Diageo where we're making sure, as part of our more inclusive culture in general, across beyond Asia Pacific, but my patch is Asia, so I care about how we show up in the wider Diageo world. Is for example, when we do town halls regionally, we now make sure that we have translation options for at least 2 to 3 of our markets. We operate across probably 10 different languages in terms of our market capacity in Asia Pacific. So I've had at most sort of 7 simultaneous languages interpreting for a regional town hall. And even just having that opens up, I think, people's minds to the idea that, wow, there's all this diversity. Yes, we all, as a multinational, operate in English because that's kind of our language of communication. But some people can better express their ideas and their true selves in their own language, or take that information in better. And we need to be able to open up the kind of option of there's more than one way of sharing the idea or getting the best ideas. We've also started doing regional town halls that are in another language, and then everybody else listens to the English translation, the simultaneous translation, and that's when you really get people going, oh, okay, this is what everyone else feels. when we call into a global discussion. So just having that unlocking of just a little bit of an awareness, and then coming in with the idea right afterwards, to take advantage of that aha moment for the person, for a function. We also look at things like our collateral materials, our global collateral materials. How much of Asia Pacific, Asian presence and faces, literally visually, can be identified as part of our global mix. So these are things that may sound quite blunt, but I think that they're crucial to kind of just getting people to remember that there's this whole other parts of the world that so many of our industries and companies are saying is the future, is the engine of growth. But again, when it comes to kind of a big global organization that's not based out of here, where sort of the representation is smaller. And just on global companies, like the top 200 global companies in the world, there was a study on Asian executive leadership teams of the top 200 companies done by the Center of Creative Leadership a few years ago. In the US, out of these top 200 companies, only 8% of executive leaders are Asian. Europe, it's lower, 2%. So as Doug said, how can they help to understand the growth and the opportunity in Asia beyond the numbers if the representation of the community that your industries are selling to is not comparable at your leadership level in some shape or form?
Yeah, it's a basic diversity and inclusion challenge. It would appear. Doug, are you seeing companies more willing to lead global marketing, global communications, global brand strategy from Asia? Obviously, Asian-based companies are excluded from that question.
No, I'm not, but I'm definitely seeing greater recognition of the innovation coming out of Asia, and there's greater appreciation for, in areas like digitization and some of the creative work, and there's greater recognition of the competence of the teams in Asia, but it's still a long way to go, and the resourcing is a key issue. We are seeing, though, greater interest in understanding Asia from various global companies, partly driven by all these crises and issues that they've been seeing, whether they've experienced them themselves or they've seen their near competitors experiencing these issues. There is a growing interest in understanding how the geopolitical situation is changing and what that means for companies operating across different markets in Asia and across the world. In the last year, we've never spent so much time talking with global CEOs and leadership teams about these kinds of issues. Lots of Zoom kind of context sharings, updates on the latest developments. So there has been a surge of interest in the last year. Everyone's interested in how's COVID changing the situation, but the other key thing is the geopolitical dynamics and dimensions, and much greater interest at that C-suite level, but also from heads of functions, people who are leading the global public affairs function or marketing or even legal and corporate affairs, other functions that are relevant to these topics. So I expect that's going to continue just as Asia just keeps getting more important. We're seeing this dynamic with many clients whose dependence on Asia is growing, and dependence on key markets in Asia is growing at the same time as their anxiety is growing. So it's they're making more money, they're profiting more from Asia, but they're also getting more worried about it. So in some ways, that's good news for us because they're spending more money and they're prepared to invest more. But there's a lot more to be done to build that kind of institutional capacity and to be thinking longer term, not just short term, thinking about kind of macro scenarios that could impact their business, as well as the very specific situations that are most relevant to them, depending on what sector they're in.
Yeah, it does seem like the rise of geopolitical issues, particularly involving the US and China, has only elevated the value of the communications function in this part of the world and of public relations council in this region. Amy, did you want to respond to something specifically on?
Yeah, just on that question about, I can say from our experience, which I'm sure would be replicated at some of the other MNCs, while as a German bank, we're a long way from having marketing led from Asia Pacific globally, there's certainly a greater degree of autonomy that's being kind of put to us in the region and empowerment. And a lot of that is stemming from the fact that the channels by which you are communicating in this part of the world are clearly different. And a very simple example of that would be WeChat. So in many of our, for us, all of our social media channels otherwise are completely managed out of Frankfurt, versus WeChat. That's something that we manage from this part of the world because there's no way that could be managed there. And I think potentially as we start to see the fora where people congregate and talk and shape opinion split a little bit, or at least assert themselves in this part of the world, that's when you're going to start to see more emphasis on the driving of that from here.
It's a really good point. There was a IPR report came out yesterday, and it interviewed comms leaders in the region and identified 5 themes. And one of them, which will not be news to anyone in this room, is that technological development in Asia often leapfrogs. And we've seen it leapfrog here and really kind of, in some markets, just completely bypass the whole laptop era, go straight to mobile to the extent that people can conduct, much of their work and life on a single social platform in a way that just you don't see to the same extent in Western markets. So I guess the question there is, are multinationals not missing a trick by, not enabling that tech innovation story to either be led out of Asia or at least to be given a lot of exposure out of Asia? And is that something that the 3 of you expect to change, or maybe it is already changing? Doug, should I start with you on that one?
Yeah, I think in terms of leading global tech firms, they're definitely investing more in Asia and building up R&D and other sort of higher value functions in Asia. But there's this kind of tension where they don't want to over communicate that because of their concerns in their home markets, where they might be criticized for doing globally significant innovation in Asia and employing lots of scientists and creating lots of high value jobs in other parts of the world, but not in their home market. So they've got to be mindful of that. But many of them are kind of, because Asia is just so critical to their growth. Some of them, for example, have huge reliance on the China market for customers, over 50% for some of them, even though they're American firms or firms from other parts of the world. So they are placing a lot more emphasis on their presence, but they also need to balance the dynamics within Asia. So, when you invest in Taiwan, how are your mainland stakeholders going to react? When you do more in Korea and Japan, how will Chinese stakeholders react when you're profiting so much from the China market? So all of that kind of intra-Asia dimension is important as well. And we're doing lots of work to help companies understand those dynamics. And a big new one over the last year has been China-India, and helping companies understand that dynamic, because most people in Western headquartered multinationals have very limited understanding of the history between the two countries and what's driving these tensions and so on. Understanding that diversity within Asia is going to be increasingly important, because so many people are they're overly China-centric. They think of Asia, they think of China. They don't think of the diversity of Southeast Asia or South Asia, and they don't have a strong sense of all of these other fast-growing parts of the region, which are very different in lots of ways, but are also still connected as part of Asia. And there is, one of the key trends is greater regional integration within Asia and self-sufficiency within Asia. So, there's all sorts of layers to this that companies need to understand to be more effective in navigating the mix of opportunities and challenges they have.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. I wanted to see if there are any questions from anyone in the room, this is your chance to ask it. Otherwise, I will keep going. I thought I saw a hand there from Mark, but no, not quite. No? Okay, I'll keep going. Just check there's none virtual. So let's come back to geopolitics, because we only really touched on it, and I feel like it's really the critical issue here in some respects, particularly when we're talking about the rise of Asia, and we're seeing companies caught up in tensions between the US and China primarily, but of course between other countries as well, both within and without Asia. Is it possible to respond globally to these issues, or does it have to be led at a local level? And can companies ever really reach a point where they come up with responses that I suppose satisfy all sides of this debate, depending on where they operate? So who wants to have a go at that one?
Well, I can have a first crack at that one. I think it's definitely increasing. It's important that they do aim to be addressing those topics at a global level, and that they have joined up discussions with the teams in Asia, the teams in the US or Europe or wherever they're headquartered, because many of the problems that we've seen are from siloed kind of decision making or decisions made at HQ that didn't adequately consult the local team. So that kind of global organisation is increasingly important. At the same time, it is much more challenging because there's contradictory expectations of stakeholders, particularly in the high tech space, because that's really the tech war is in parallel to the trade war, and that's geopolitics are a key aspect of that. So when there are big concerns about how global companies might be facilitating the development of the local technology ecosystems in different parts of Asia because of the geostrategic implications or the dual use potential of different technologies. It's just getting harder and harder to kind of be able to reconcile all of those competing demands and expectations.
Yeah, just add to that, being joined up as being sort of it's challenging, and you might not have that single sort of silver bullet response for whatever topic that might be. But I think with multinationals now operating across so many different markets, and you have lots of different stakeholders even within the market itself, let alone when you kind of go into region or global, that having, say, your comms people prominently known within the organization that if something is happening, that this is where you go, and also that the comms structure and processes are quite tight across the whole organizational function, from global to regional to local, I think is key. And the most basic starting point to be able to come to a view that reflects what the organization wants to say and needs to say, if anything.
So stronger, more robust internal communications processes are just as important here, I suppose, as the external angle. Amy, did you want to add anything on that? You've managed to so far.
It's basically the same. That's the million-dollar question. Any company that's operating across borders in a world that is potentially getting a little bit less friendly to full globalization is navigating a very, very tricky set of circumstances. And I think most multinationals that have been doing this for a long time, particularly in emerging markets and stuff, generally adhere to a pretty solid set of global principles, and try to make sure that those are universally standard while understanding, again, the nuances locally. So I don't think anything earth-shattering there.
Well, I mean, I think it comes back to basics, right? It's just a very difficult one. I don't think anyone has got the answer, do they? If anyone does, please feel free to share. I think we're out of time, so I just want to thank my fabulous panelists, Amy, Asma, and Doug, really interesting conversation, really interesting context and data as well. So thank you all. We're going to be back shortly with our next session.